Please be seated.
Good morning, everybody, and good morning to you, Madam Registrar. Could you call the case, please?
Good morning, Your Honors. This is the case number IT 05-88, the prosecutor versus Vadim Popović.
I thank you, ma'am. All the accused are present. Prosecution, it's Mr. McCloskey and Mr. Van der Puy, who are present today. Amongst the defense teams, I notice the absence of Mr. Nikolic from the Beara team, Mr. Burgon from the Nikolic team. Petrusic here or not? No. Mr. Petrusic from the Miletic team, and that's it. All right. Today we are going to start. Do you have any preliminaries, by the way? I am informed that we are to expect some filings from the prosecution in response to some of the Borovčanin motions. Is that correct?
I'm told we filed some motions on Friday, 3.
All right, okay. Thank you. Yes, Mr. Gosner.
Your Honor, one preliminary in relation to that. We plan to be filing a reply in response to the motion in respect of protective measures. So we would kindly request that the Chamber hold off for a couple of days so that we have an opportunity to make that application.
Okay, thank you. So today we start with the Borovčanin defense. Is there going to be an opening statement? Yes, Mr. Gosner.
Yes, Your Honor, there will be an opening statement.
How long do you intend to be speaking?
I hope not to exceed 45 minutes, Your Honor.
All right, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. President, Your Honors. I'm privileged to appear before you this morning to present the opening statement on behalf of Mr. Ljubomir Borovčanin. Your Honors, at the risk of oversimplifying a very complicated and extensive indictment, Mr. Borovčanin is essentially charged with 2 overarching crimes: forcibly transferring the civilian population of Srebrenica and mass murdering the military-aged men of Srebrenica. The prosecution says that he committed these crimes as part of a joint criminal enterprise to which he contributed by allowing men under his command to assist with the evacuation of Potočari on the 12th and 13th of July, knowing that the civilians had been and were being coerced to leave. As to the mass murder and genocide charge, the prosecution alleges that Mr. Borovčanin allowed his units to assist in the separation of military-aged men at Potočari, knowing that they were going to be killed. They also alleged that he assisted and ordered his units to take prisoners along the Konjević-Polje road on the 13th of July, again, knowing that they would all be killed. Not only knowing that they would all be killed, but intending that they would be killed. Your Honors, the case against Mr. Borovčanin is based upon the fallacy of omniscience. The prosecution imputes to Mr. Borovčanin knowledge of everything that happened in Srebrenica before his arrival there on the 11th of July. And they impute to him knowledge of everything that would happen after the 12th and 13th of July. Now, the prosecution is, of course, perfectly entitled to build their case on inference, to invite you to draw inferences as to his state of mind and his state of knowledge based upon his conduct. But to establish that he knew and intended that these mass killings would occur and that he was participating in them, they must show you that that's the only reasonable conclusion consistent with his actions. In our view, the evidence presented by the prosecution does not show that. On the contrary, the evidence shows that Mr. Borovčanin did his best to act lawfully and honorably, despite the difficult circumstances that he was facing and that were not of his creation. We have nevertheless decided, even though we believe that already the evidence is not sufficient, to offer additional evidence on limited topics, hoping that it will assist you to understand Mr. Borovčanin's position at the time and the circumstances that he was facing. Our evidence will focus on 5 issues. First, the nature of Mr. Borovčanin's authority as a MOOP commander assigned to a VRS zone of responsibility. Second, the ad hoc and transitory nature of his command to the units that he had not previously commanded without the assistance of any command staff or even a deputy commander. Third, the character of the units assigned to him, which included a group of ill-trained deserters. Fourth, the limited scope of his involvement in relation to prisoners of war. And fifth, the nature of the military threat facing his units on the ground and the reasonableness of detaining large numbers of military-aged men in civilian clothing from the enclave. Now, what I propose to do in this opening statement, Your Honors, is to summarize the prosecution case and to highlight for you the specific areas on which we will be presenting evidence. We believe that this summary is indispensable to understanding the relevance of the information that you'll be hearing, particularly because there are many aspects of the prosecution case that we do not dispute. Our point of disagreement with the prosecution is their characterization of what Mr. Borovčanin knew and what reasonable inferences you, as a trial chamber, can draw from the circumstances about what he must have known. Now let me start with the forcible transfer charge. You'll recall, Your Honors, that the prosecution alleges that the criminal effort to forcibly transfer the civilian population of Srebrenica starts in March 1995. According to the prosecution, supplies are progressively cut off to the enclave with the intention of forcing the civilians to leave. That effort then, according to the prosecution, escalates on the 6th of July, or about the 6th of July, when an armed offensive was commenced, at least in part, according to the prosecution, to terrorize the civilian population into leaving. This effort culminates in the takeover of Srebrenica town on the 11th of July. Now, Your Honors, what was Mr. Borovčanin doing throughout this period, from March 1995 through the 11th of July 1995? How was he contributing to this alleged joint criminal enterprise? In fact, throughout that period, Mr. Borovčanin was 200 kilometers away, engaged in intense combat with Bosnian armed forces in the area around Sarajevo. He was the deputy commander at that time, and through July 1995, of the Special Police Brigade. As you'll hear from our first witness, Dr. Bajagic, the Special Police was a component of the Ministry of the Interior akin to the gendarme or the carabinieri. Their purpose in peacetime was to respond to extreme civil unrest, such as riots. During the war, however, they could be, and often were, deployed in combat. While in combat, they ceased to have any civil policing function and were subject to military command and military rules. From March 1995 until the 10th of July, Mr. Borovčanin was in the area of Sarajevo. To be precise, at Majevica and Treskovica. He had no involvement in the affairs of Srebrenica during that time. He received no orders, he received no planning documents, he received no reports. And in fairness, the prosecution hasn't suggested otherwise. On the 10th of July, he received an order from the MUP staff commander that he should go to Srebrenica to assist in combat tasks. The order indicated that the units that would be under his command, and specifically directed him to report to General Krstić. This was in accordance with the usual procedure and applicable legislation. When acting in a combat role, MUP units were resubordinated to the VRS command, in whose zone of responsibility they were to be deployed. Mr. Borovčanin followed this order, arriving in Bratunac on the 11th of July, early in the afternoon. None of the units that were supposed to be assigned to him had yet arrived. He then went up to the Drina Corps forward command post at Pribitsevac, trying to obtain orders. He received some general instructions at that time from General Mladic over the telephone, and then returned to Bratunac. By then it was late afternoon, and the first of his 3 units that would eventually arrive had arrived at that time. He sent them to the place where they would be billeted overnight and did not issue them any tasks or orders in relation to Potočari or Srebrenica. As it turned out, Mr. Borovčanin would not receive a concrete combat task until late on the evening of the 11th, when he went and reconnoitered the terrain around Zuti Most. Now, by this time, Your Honors, the Srebrenica enclave had already fallen. General Mladic, as you've seen on the trial video, had already strolled down the main street of Srebrenica town. The inhabitants of Srebrenica had already fled to Potočari, or they had assembled as part of the column and were preparing to break through towards Tuzla. You've seen the video of the chaos and the panic that already prevailed in the afternoon of the 11th of July. You've seen the displacement of the population to the factories in Potočari. All of this happens before Mr. Borovčanin has come near Potočari, much less issued any orders in support of any operation in relation to Srebrenica. And something else significant happens before Mr. Borovčanin has done anything in support of operations around Potočari. Colonel Karamans arrives at the Hotel Fontana on the evening of the 11th and conveys a request to General Mladic that he says has come from the Bosnian government and from UNPROFOR that the refugees should be evacuated. You've seen that very request on the trial video. Now, why is this significant? It's significant, Your Honors, because it shows that the die has already been cast by the evening of the 11th of July. Whatever has happened to induce the refugees to leave Srebrenica had already happened, and without any involvement or assistance of Mr. Borovčanin. The evacuation of the refugees by that point is an inevitability, supported even by UNPROFOR and the Bosnian government. Now, as I just mentioned, late on the evening of the 11th of July, Mr. Borovčanin finally receives an order about what he'll be doing the next day. He is told to prepare to secure the northern approaches to Potočari. On the morning of the 12th of July, Mr. Borovčanin follows that order and goes to Žuti The 3 units that were assigned to him have arrived or do arrive and deploy to that area. 2 of the units are MUP units. The 2nd Sekavici detachment of the Special Police Brigade and the 1st PJP company of the Zvornik Public Security Center. We've already mentioned the Special Police Brigade. PJP units, as Dr. Bajagic will explain, are comprised of local police officers from a particular area who can be formed into a combat unit and deployed in combat. The 3rd unit assigned to Mr. Borovčanin, as you'll hear during our case, was not even a unit in the true sense of the term. It was just a group of deserters who, at that moment, happened to be undergoing training at the MUP training facility in Jahorina. They were deserters in the true sense of the term. All of them had been arrested in Serbia or Montenegro and returned by force to the Republika Srpska. They were poorly trained and poorly motivated. All told, these 3 units, under Mr. Borovčanin's command, consisted of 250 men, approximately. Now, one of the matters on which you will hear testimony from our expert witnesses is the ad hoc nature of Mr. Borovčanin's command. These 3 units were cobbled together extemporaneously and had never previously cooperated in a joint operation. They are put under his command temporarily. He has no command staff to assist him. He has no security organ. He has no logistics. He doesn't even have military lawyers to advise him on the legality of the orders that he is receiving at this time. He has no choice but to rely on the VRS commander in whose area of responsibility he is assigned for logistical support, security support, and perhaps most importantly, for information. Mr. Borovčanin himself spends most of that morning on the 12th of July between Žuti and Potočari, while his units move through the terrain on either side of the road. You've already heard some evidence during the prosecution case about that movement. For the most part, we do not contest that evidence. Their task is to ensure that no BIH army forces are in the area. Now remember, at this stage, the whereabouts of the 28th Division of the BIH Army is unknown to the Serb forces. You will hear during our case from 3 members of the 1st PJP Company who confirm that they arrived at Zutimos, that there were no hostilities there with UNPROFOR forces, that they moved through the terrain to the west of the road, that a soldier from the Bratunats Brigade was seriously injured by a landmine, and that having found no sign of Muslim forces, they returned to the main road between Bratunats and Potocari. And that after waiting there for some period of time, they returned to Bratunats before being redeployed north along the Bratunats-Konjevic-Polje road. Neither the 1st PJP Company nor the 2nd Sekovici Detachment had any involvement in the evacuation or separation of men in Potocari. Mr. Borovčanin himself moved up the main road towards Potocari, and he arrived there late in the morning of the 12th of July. He sees there an enormous crowd of civilians who are unmistakably waiting to be taken away, waiting to be evacuated. In fact, desperate to be evacuated. And that's precisely what has already been agreed to by UNPROFOR, the VRS, and the Bosnian government. At some point around this time, Mr. Borovčanin has what I think can be fairly characterized as a verbal altercation with General Mladić. I won't remind you of the epithet Mladić uses to describe the MOOP, according to PW 160. In any event, Mladić orders Borovčanin to deploy his 2 combat-worthy units along the Bratunets-Konjevic-Polje road in case the column of the 28th Division should attempt to go in that direction. Mladić also orders Mr. Borovčanin to leave behind his deserters unit in Potocari to assist with the evacuation that he says has been agreed to. Now, let's be clear how important Mr. Borovčanin's response is from the prosecution's perspective. According to the prosecution theory, Mr. Borovčanin allowed his men to be used in the evacuation not only to ensure the deportation and forcible transfer, but also to assist with the separation of the military-age men. And I quote from paragraph 43 of the indictment, with full knowledge that those men would be summarily executed. Now, the prosecution did not present any evidence showing that Mr. Borovčanin had been informed of any such thing. He wasn't at the Hotel Fontana meetings. He wasn't having private meetings with Generals Mladić or Krstić or Blagojević. And as you'll hear from our expert, Dr. Ristovojević, his units had no particular role or responsibility in respect of prisoners of war. What the prosecution is really saying is that leaving behind the Yahourina deserters for the purpose of the separations itself shows you that he had the knowledge and the intent of what was going, of these criminal acts that are alleged. And it also serves the purpose of showing not only that the detentions and the executions were going to take place, but that the forcible transfer was taking place. In other words, by this single action, 2 JCEs are conveniently established. Now, if any of us had been a lawyer on Mr. Borovčanin's non-existent staff on the morning of the 12th of July, and we were asked to give an opinion on the legality of an order to assist with that evacuation, which, so we were told, had been agreed to by the Bosnian government, by UNPROFOR, what would we have been able to say? Would we really have been able to say, no, Mr. Borovčanin, you must not participate in this action? Because civilians may have been, over the last week, over the last month, over the last several months, intimidated or coerced or otherwise improperly induced to leave? Could we really say to him, no, you can't participate, notwithstanding the circumstances of thousands of civilians who are desperate to leave? And how would our analysis have been affected if we knew that in 1993, hundreds of civilians had been evacuated under the aegis of UNPROFOR and UNHCR? Well, we'll leave the answer to those questions, Your Honors, for closing arguments. But the point is that Mr. Borovčanin complied with the order. He directed the commander of the Yahourina deserters to remain behind, to assist in the evacuation. Evidence presented during the prosecution case shows that Momir Nikolic then took charge of directing the evacuation operation. He was effectively in command of that unit during those 2 days. Now, what did Mr. Borovčanin see at Potočari while he was there on the 12th and 13th of July? Was there anything in the manner of the detention or separation that would have suggested that all those men were going to be slaughtered? Well, let's consider what Mr. Borovčanin could have seen on the 12th and 13th of July in Potočari. He left Potočari on the 12th, before the separations began. He didn't return until the 13th, when he came back with the journalist for about half an hour to deal with the issue of the stolen water truck. On the 13th of July, as you've seen from the videotape shot that day, Mr. Borovčanin would have seen the men of military age being detained in a house opposite the Dutchback compound. But there's absolutely nothing improper or inappropriate in detaining suspected combatants. even if they are wearing civilian clothes. International humanitarian law allows that. In fact, reasonable grounds existed to presume that in July 1995, all the men of military age were, at least potentially, combatants. We will present some of the very large number, the surprisingly large number, of BIH Army documents showing that by July 1995, the Srebrenica enclave was to a very large extent an armed camp. The purpose of this evidence, Your Honors, is not to establish any tu quoque defense. The purpose of this evidence, rather, is to show that it would have been entirely normal and prudent to detain every military-aged person leaving Srebrenica at that time. We will tender documents showing that the BIH Army had at least 6,000 armed combatants in Srebrenica, with as many as 10,000 more unarmed or periodically armed. That these men were organized into units with defined zones of responsibility and specialist tasks. That teenagers as young as 15 years old were being inducted into the military. And that combatants often wore civilian clothing. The need for uniforms was so extreme, and the number required was so enormous, that on the 4th of June, Ramiz Batirovich, the chief of staff of the 28th Division in Srebrenica, sent a request for 7,000 uniforms to the 2nd Corps of the BIH Army. In this context, Your Honors, the detention of all military-aged men would not and should not have set off alarm bells that they were all going to be killed. Apart from this, the prosecution points to the conditions of detention and the wholesale confiscation of belongings to suggest that this should have been evident. Again, Mr. Borovčanin's opportunity to observe that was limited. You yourselves have already seen about as much as Mr. Borovčanin could have seen on the 13th of July during the half hour that he was there. You see men crowded into the so-called White House, their belongings dumped on the ground outside. The grainy video of those men crowded together is a chilling sight in light of what we now know happened to many of them. But at the time, nothing in those conditions would have indicated that they were all going to be executed en masse. Now, you've heard other evidence about violent acts taking place in Popović on the 12th and 13th of July, about identification cards being burned or confiscated. We dispute that these events occurred in the manner described by the prosecution. But even if you accept that they did occur, there is simply no evidence whatsoever showing that Mr. Borovčanin observed these alleged incidents. Now, would it be natural to expect that he would be informed about those incidents? Well, Your Honors, as I've previously mentioned, Momir Nikolic was in effective command of the men that he had left behind. Mr. Borovčanin had no particular role in regulating the detention of prisoners of war, and that will be confirmed by Dr. Ristovojevic, who will explain that his units, in light of their lack of support, would only have responsibility at the point of surrender of a POW. On the 12th and 13th of July, Mr. Borovčanin was primarily preoccupied with deploying his units along the Konjević-Polje road. Now, why was he doing that? He was doing that because there was a huge column consisting of between 12 and 15,000 people, many of whom were members of the 28th Division, and amongst whom 6,000 or 7,000 were armed. They were heading north, parallel to the road between Bratunec and Konjević-Polje. Throughout the night of the 12th to the 13th, the road was an active combat zone. You've already heard some evidence about that fighting. You'll hear more about it from 3 members of the PJP unit assigned there, 2 of whom were seriously wounded on the morning of the 13th. Now that day, on the 13th, members of the Bosnian column started to surrender. Some were detained at the Sandici Meadow. As you recall, General Mladic arrives, telling the men that they will be exchanged and sent to Kladanja or Tuzla. Mr. Borovčanin leaves the meadow before Mladic finishes speaking and proceeds north up the road. The prisoners are then apparently escorted or bused south from the meadow to the Kravica warehouse. The prosecution theory is that Mr. Borovčanin organized the detention of those men with the intention that they should be killed. They also allege that they were in fact killed by Mr. Borovčanin's subordinates at the Kravica warehouse. The cornerstone of the prosecution case is the fact that Mr. Borovčanin passed in front of the Kravica warehouse on the afternoon of the 13th and saw bodies there, as you've seen from the Petrović videotape. Let's consider a few aspects of this evidence, in particular as it relates to the critical issue of Mr. Borovčanin's intent. First, let's remember that Mr. Borovčanin walked into an interview with the Office of the Prosecutor in 2002, initially without a lawyer, and freely admitted that. He placed himself on the scene and said what he had seen. This is not the admission of a person is likely to make if they had participated and intended those killings. Now, the prosecutor dismisses this, saying that Mr. Borovčanin had no choice but to make that admission. You remember during their opening statement, they indicated, and I quote, "Of course he had to. It was on film, and it was acknowledged." Your Honors, where did that videotape come from? Mr. Borovčanin gave them that videotape. Let me say that again. The videotape showing the bodies in front of the Kravitsa warehouse was provided by Mr. Borovčanin at a time when the OTP did not have it. In other words, the very cornerstone, the crux of the prosecution case is based on something that Mr. Borovčanin admitted and then supplied clear evidence was true. Mr. Borovčanin further explained in his interview that he stopped at the driveway to the warehouse compound, which is some distance down the road from the shots that you've seen on the video, that he was told that there had been an attempt by prisoners to escape, that the people who had done the killings at the warehouse were not from the police. He then got back into his car and drove to Bratunac, where he understood one of his officers was wounded. The prosecution asks you to infer from these acts that Mr. Borovčanin intended that those men should all be killed, and that he was part of a joint criminal enterprise to that end. Your Honors, the prosecution position defies common sense for several reasons. First, there is Mr. Borovčanin's own conduct in his interviews with the Office of the Prosecutor. The open avowal of what he saw when he did not have to is hardly the conduct of a man who actually did intend those killings. Second, Mr. Borovčanin was accompanied throughout the 13th of July by a journalist with a video camera who was filming indiscriminately whatever he saw. The prosecution dismisses this individual as a quasi-journalist. Well, the point is, Your Honors, this individual was from a respected television station, and he had a video camera. If Mr. Borovčanin had the intent that there would be massacres of Muslim detainees, when he drove from Potocari, where he was dealing with the tank, up the Bratunac-Konjevic-Polier Road, would he really have taken someone with a video camera? Or would he rather have simply dropped that person off in Bratunac on his way to the area? The prosecution also alleges that Mr. Borovčanin had a duty to intervene based on what he saw at that moment at the warehouse. And they seem to suggest that not only does this establish responsibility under Article 7.3 as a superior, but also from that failure to intervene that you should infer his intent that those killings should take place. Your Honors, the evidence does suggest that there were 2 members of the 2nd Sakabichi detachment at the warehouse. According to hearsay evidence presented during the prosecution case, one of them was named Krsto Dragicevich, and he asked to be relieved of his duties along the road where he was deployed so that he could speak to the detainees about the fate of his father, who apparently had disappeared in the area some time before. His commander, Rade Chutorich, perhaps concerned about what he might do, accompanied him. Now, Mr. Borovčanin, of course, does not know about this sequence of events. He is north on the road between Sandici and Konjević Polje. The prosecution theory of what happens next is that there is an execution, a planned execution at the Kravica warehouse, and that after this execution has started, the prisoners surge out, manage to grab a gun, kill Krsto, and injure Chutorich. Now, Mr. Borovčanin, when he does arrive back at the warehouse later on, is told something different. He is told that the prisoners, as I've mentioned earlier, had attempted to escape, and that no police were involved in the killings. The prosecution presented no evidence showing which of these 2 accounts is correct. They presented no evidence about what happened to initiate the shooting. What we do know is that Mr. Borovčanin received frantic calls over his Motorola. He did not himself hear Chutorich's voice because he was out of range. All he heard was a response by someone at Sandici Meadow. This is in Mr. Borovčanin's own statement. It's tentatively confirmed by Mr. Petrović, and we will corroborate that evidence by presenting you with the results of field tests showing that a Motorola signal could not be heard between the Kravica warehouse and the position where Mr. Borovčanin was located. And by the time Mr. Borovčanin passes by the warehouse, Krsto is already dead, and Chutorich is on his way back to Bratunac with the injured hands. So at least these 2 subordinates, or alleged subordinates, of Mr. Borovčanin are not committing crimes at the warehouse. No evidence was presented during the prosecution case showing that Mr. Borovčanin's other men were there at the warehouse, much less that he should have known that they were there. On the contrary, the evidence suggests that his units were not in control of the Kravica warehouse. They were spread out along the road further to the north, preventing the column from crossing the road. You've also heard evidence that it was not the police who escorted the prisoners from the meadow, but that it was others. And you also have the testimony from one of the Muslim survivors at the warehouse, who said that the people at the warehouse guarding them were not the same as the ones guarding them at Sandichi Meadow. Your Honors, the prosecution has also alleged, or perhaps just implied, that the warehouse was in an area controlled by Mr. Borovčanin's units, and for which he is therefore responsible. This is both factually and legally incorrect. Our experts will demonstrate that MOOP units were not assigned distinct areas of responsibility in the military sense. Rather, they were inserted into pre-existing areas of responsibility of the Army units. The notion that the warehouse was within a MOOP zone of responsibility is simply wrong. Second, you'll hear also from our experts that members of the Special Police, including Mr. Borovčanin, did not have ranks in 1995, in July 1995. He was not an officer, much less a superior officer. His sole authority was to command police officers in his units. He had no authority whatsoever to order any other soldier to do or not do anything. And Your Honors, leaving aside these deficiencies, concerning who perpetrated the killings at Kravitsa Warehouse, how it happened, and whether Mr. Borovčanin had any authority to intervene, we take issue with a more fundamental problem. The prosecution argues that Mr. Borovčanin's failure to investigate further shows his intent. This is fundamentally contrary to basic principles of criminal law, not to mention human nature. Failing to make further inquiry to determine whether a crime has been committed cannot be equated with the intent to commit that crime. This is not a case where an accused sees his subordinates repeatedly commit crimes. This is a case of a single event bursting on the accused suddenly, where he has no basis to believe at the time that his men are involved. And further, where he has no authority to intervene. Now, failing to intervene under those circumstances cannot lead to the inference that Mr. Borovčanin intended the commission of those crimes. And in fact, you will hear evidence from two witnesses who will describe Mr. Borovčanin's reaction late on the afternoon of the 13th of July, when he arrives back in Bratunac. Mr. Borovčanin arrived at the Bratunac police station in a very agitated state and asked to be connected to the Bratunac Brigade headquarters. His duty, as you'll hear from our experts, while subordinated to the VRS was to report any criminal conduct to his military superiors. Even assuming, which we do not accept, that anyone from the 2nd Sekavici detachment may have been involved at the Kravitsa warehouse, unbeknownst to Mr. Borovčanin, his primary duty was to report what he knew about the commission or possible commission of crimes up his chain of command. And as you'll also hear from our experts, responsibility for further investigations and, if necessary, prosecution rested with the brigade authorities. That was prescribed by regulation, but more importantly, it's also reasonable and sensible in light of the transitory nature of Mr. Borovčanin's command. He doesn't have resources to undertake investigations, and he doesn't have jurisdiction over anyone other than his own men. In that context, it's more suitable that such reporting and such investigations occur to the brigade. Now, what about the alleged Krstić intercept? We will not be adducing any specific evidence on this. We contest that the person with whom General Krstić is speaking is Mr. Borovčanin. But even if it were Mr. Borovčanin, we think that when you view this rather anodyne conversation in light of the totality of the evidence, it hardly shows that Mr. Borovčanin was engaging in a broad criminal conspiracy to execute thousands of Muslim civilians or detainees. Your Honors, you're also going to hear or read evidence of the good character of Mr. Borovčanin. This is a man who has, and I quote, a warrior's sense of honor. A man who tries to find, and I quote again, common sense compromises in times of crisis to avoid violence. Those are not my words, Your Honors. That's the opinion of an American general who worked with Mr. Borovčanin during the implementation of the Dayton Accords. In conclusion, Your Honors, our case is about adding context and perspective to the evidence that has already been presented by the prosecution. We're confident that once you have the benefit of all that evidence, you will see that Mr. Borovčanin did not intend mass murder, that he did not intend forcible transfer, and that he did not intend any of the other crimes alleged against him. He was trying his best to deal with the humanitarian consequences of the takeover of territory on which there were 30,000 civilians who were terrified and desperate to leave. At the same time, he was trying to fulfill combat duties that had been assigned to him in response to a credible and real combat threat. This naturally involved taking prisoners. This is a normal, if perhaps unpleasant, consequence of combat. And very serious crimes were subsequently committed against those detainees. But to lay that at the feet of Mr. Borovčanin, to say that he knew about that in advance, without any meaningful evidence, and by conflating his cooperation with others in the military affairs, the military offensive, is unjust and unfair. It verges, in fact, on an attempt to impose collective responsibility for those crimes without bothering with the essential elements of criminal responsibility, such as individual intent. Your Honors, I'm relatively new to this case, and I wish to repeat that I'm honored to be here before you and amongst respected colleagues. And I'm also deeply honored to be representing Mr. Borovčanin and to have had this opportunity to address you on his behalf. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Gosnell. Now I think we can proceed with the first witness. Now let me brief you a little bit on what's going to happen today. Due to unforeseen circumstances, we will need to stop at 13:25 instead of at 13:45 in order to try and gain a little bit from the time which would be lost. We have agreed to reduce the breaks from the usual time to 20 minutes. So we'll have 2 breaks as usual, but they will be of 20 minutes duration. The first one will be in about 12 minutes time. So in the meantime, we can start with the first witness, and then we'll have a break at 10:20. No, if you want, we can have it now. It's only to try and keep. Good morning to you, Professor.
Good morning.
Good morning.
And you're most welcome to this tribunal. As you are aware, you've been summoned as an expert witness by the defense team for Lyubomir Borovčanin in this case. You will be starting your evidence, your testimony soon. Before you do so, our rules require that you enter a solemn declaration, text of which is being handed to you now. That's to the effect that in the course of your testimony you will be speaking the truth. Please go ahead, read it out aloud, and that will be your solemn commitment with us.
Hvala lijepa.
Thank you very much. I solemnly declare that I will speak the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
I thank you. Please make yourself comfortable. Mr. Lazarevich will introduce himself to you shortly. will go first. It will then be followed by others on cross-examination. Mr. Lazarevic.
Good morning, Your Honors. Dobro jutro, doktore.
Question. Good morning, Dr. Bajagic. Of course, we had an opportunity to meet several times prior to this day, but for the record, I would ask you to... I'm going to represent or introduce myself. My name is Lazarevic, and I am part of the defense team of Mr. Borovčanin. Now, for the record, please state your full name. Answer. My name is Mladen Bajagic. Question. Just a little warning before we begin. Since we both speak the same language, and in order to avoid a situation in which we might overlap, could you please be so kind to wait until I finish my question, and you can see that on the transcript in front of you. As soon as it stops, then you can start giving your answer. Thereby we shall avoid any possible problems. Dr. Bajagic, can you tell us the place and the date of your birth? Answer. I was born on the 5th April 1962 in Sarajevo, the then Socialist Republic of Bosnia and Herzegovina, which was part of the SFRY. Question. Tell me where you finished primary and secondary schools. Answer. I finished my primary and secondary schools in Sarajevo. Question. After finishing secondary school, did you enroll in the university? Answer, yes, I did. Question. Can you tell me which university, when did you graduate, what did you study? Answer. I enrolled in the Faculty of Political Sciences at the Sarajevo University. And graduated in 1988. Question. After the university, did you acquire any other academic titles? Answer. Yes, I did. In the period between 1997 and the year 2000, I attended master's degree studies at the Faculty of Political Sciences at the Belgrade University. And in the year 2000, I earned the title of Master of Political Sciences. Question. Thank you very much. Answer. After that, I entered into the course for a PhD and I defended my doctor's thesis in 2006. Again at the Faculty of Political Sciences in Belgrade. and thereby I earned the title of the doctor or the doctor's degree in the political science and international relations. Question, thank you very much. Can you just tell me now, because I would like to go through shortly through your career. After the university, what was your first job? Answer. Even before I graduated and during a period after I graduated and earned my bachelor's degree, I worked in journalism, and I was also involved in the then socio-political organizations that existed at the time in Bosnia and Herzegovina. Question, when you say socio-political organizations, can you tell us a little bit more what that involves? Because I suppose this is a rather foreign term to the people who are not from that region. Answer. At the time, in all republics of the former Yugoslavia, there were a number of political organizations that worked under the umbrella of the then League of Communists. Among them were the Alliance of the Socialist Youth, and the Socialist Alliance of Working People. Question, thank you very much. Can you tell us how your career progressed from that point onwards? Answer, in 1992, I found a job with the then National Security Service, which was later to become the State Security Department. Of the Ministry of the Interior of Republika Srpska. Question, thank you very much. Can you tell me, please, what kind of duties you discharged within the National Security Service of Republika Srpska? Answer. Given that I had a university degree, I was given the job of an operational worker in the, or the operative in the State Security Department.
Take a break at 10:20, which is right now, so.